I would like to start by thanking all the speakers for taking time out of their certainly busy schedule to do this here this afternoon. And I particularly want to thank Eric Schmidt that he was willing to do this. He was chairing, I think we can call that, Eric, a thought-provoking, very comprehensive, very meaningful report and commission. And this is, by the way, the first part of the event. Eric will speak about the results of the final report of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And we will have then a little chat. Eric and I will pose a few questions, which will be very difficult for him to answer. But yeah, well, we have the Biden visit coming up, for instance. That might be one of the things. But before I hand the floor to Eric, well, usually a man like Eric you introduce by saying this man needs no introduction. Indeed, I can make it very short. Eric is, as you all know, very accomplished entrepreneur, manager, technologist. Remember his CEO and then chairman term at Google between, I think it was some 10 years, Eric, 2001 to 2017, I think it is, if we look at the chairmanship of Google as well. He's a very successful investor. He's a philanthropist. He's a commission chairman, as we see. He is still, I think, Eric, under your control, heading the Defense Innovation Board for the US government, and now the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And most importantly, many people don't know that, he's also a very seasoned pilot, fixed wing as well as rotary wing. And Eric and I were just talking about last time we saw each other in person was when he was piloting an A380 in Toulouse. So he's really a very accomplished aviator. So Eric, with this introduction, I think the man who needs no introduction, you can jump right into the topic and present the most important recommendations of the report as you see it.
I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk about this report. Gilman Louie, who's one of our commissioners, is also joining us, and I'd like to bring him into the conversation once we get started, because he's exceptional as well. A little bit about the history, and I should say that, Tom, you've been a close friend and partner over decades, and I hope that will continue on these matters as well, because they're so important. The Congress in 2018, the US Congress created a group of which I was elected chair to look at the national security implications of artificial intelligence. So we were given 2 years and a fair amount of money, surprisingly, to do this analysis. We had access to literally hundreds of the people in the US government and some people in European governments to talk about this. And we tried to answer a number of questions. Where were we with AI? How were we doing against our competitors? How would it emerge? And most importantly, from a US perspective, what changes in the law were needed? We released our report about 2 months ago. It's 751 pages, so it's quite lengthy. And it's fairly US-centric. And so for those of you who are German or in the United States or in Europe, I apologize for that, but it was written for the US Congress as a customer. We do, however, talk about the importance of partnerships, and I'll say some things specifically about Germany and China in a few minutes. So the process that we followed was we looked at the overall situation and we came to a couple of conclusions. The first, and I'll again speak in the US terms, that the US needs to be ready by 2025 and is not today, is unprepared for the emerging competition around artificial intelligence. We talk a lot about where we are, and I'll summarize by saying that we concluded that we're somewhat ahead of China, but not by much. We don't say this in report, but my personal opinion is, 1 to 2 years. It's not 5 or 10. And you sit there and you go, why is this important? And in our report, we spend a fair amount of time talking about how artificial intelligence will change the nature of national security, cyber war of one kind or another, intelligence matters, misinformation, the online society, and of course, the actual operation of our militaries. And we looked at this pretty carefully. We also looked at some of the things that we should do. And one of the things that we decided, for example, was that the United States needs to increase its investment in R&D by doubling it every year over the next 3 or 4 years. The US Congress, by the way, has largely agreed to that, and this legislation that Biden is pushing through now has some of this. Another area that we talk about is semiconductors. For those of you who don't know, artificial intelligence is the software, which I'll talk about it some more, but it's also very specialized hardware. It's hardware that's much, much faster than the computer chip that you have on your computer today. And that those specialized chips are a source of competitive advantage. And we say that it's important for the United States to stay 2 generations ahead of China on this matter. It's also important to know that at the moment, the United States largely got out of this business and ceded leadership to South Korea and Taiwan, Taiwan being 110 miles from mainland China, as you know, and in particular, a company called TSMC. And to give you an example, I'm speaking to you on a Mac that uses a 5 nanometer, and smaller is better, chip that's made by TSMC. The American firms couldn't make that chip. And now the US is trying to get TSMC to start building those chips in the United States. China has a similar focus on Taiwan, trying to get the similar technology brought into China. So this competition around semiconductors is really important. Now you sit there and you go, why does it matter? Well, it obviously matters for computation in an airplane and so forth, but it also matters for global competitiveness. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about that. Another thing that we talk about at some length is talent. And I don't fully understand how the European governments are organized, but I would venture to say that although the Europeans that I've dealt with are very intelligent, and probably smarter, if I may say, than the US government. They're not technically trained in these areas. Very few people are. It's very complicated. It's very hard math. And frankly, I would say that the European governments don't understand it any better than the United States government, and that's a problem. And we spent a fair amount of time suggesting that. We also spent a fair amount of time in our report talking about the importance of partnerships. And we've identified the notion of a technology group, a T10, a T12. There are various terms of this. And these are the countries that are big enough leading in technology to actually make a difference and move the platform forward. And let me tell you who they are. Japan, South Korea, maybe India, the United States, Germany, France, the UK, Israel, maybe a few other countries. It's on the order of 10 or 12, we can call them techno-democracies for lack of a better term. These are democracies that have the kind of values that democracies have that need to excel in this. And we say that those groups need to basically form what we call an emerging technology cooperation, where we combine our forces to make sure that we're bringing this technology forward in a way that's consistent with our values. We also spend a fair amount of time in our report talking about values. And the technology of AI can be used for evil as well as good. And in particular, it can be used for very powerful surveillance. I don't need to tell Germans about surveillance. You have lived it. And there's every reason to think that AI could be used to survey each and every one of you in very, very thorough ways. You don't want that. It's not legal in your country. And you also don't want to be using Chinese technology, which has it embedded in it. So we talk a fair amount about that. So overall, to summarize where we are, our report is in the process of being adopted by the US Congress. We're getting a huge increase in semiconductor funding. We're getting a huge increase in R&D funding. The State Department has established an international technology group to work with fellow governments. What we need now is we need your governments to say, we agree. And now if I can just finish by saying, and I want to be a little bit controversial here, so I apologize, Thomas. I am concerned that Europeans don't understand how serious this is. I am concerned that Europeans think that Europeans can play both sides, that is the US and China. I just don't think that that's a reasonable strategy. I want Europeans to come to the same conclusions that our commission did. And I would encourage your governments to form a commission not unlike ours. And we're very happy to collaborate with yours to see where we agree and where we disagree. What's interesting is everyone says, oh, we disagree over privacy. Oh, we disagree over taxes. The disagreements between the Western countries are tiny and not important compared to the fundamental disagreements of technologies from authoritarian countries, which are command and control. They're not democracies. They're not organized around personal freedom. Those differences are profound. It's important that the Western model of this technology become the global or dominant versions.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Eric, for this succinct summary of a very comprehensive report, very important topic. I mean, sometimes when I read the report, not all of it, I have to admit, I'm usually stuck with executive committee, but it's almost, the conclusions you draw, going even to create new academies for digital knowledge, for digital education, etc. It's almost like a Manhattan Project. It's so comprehensive and so important. Do you think artificial intelligence is, in terms of long-term importance, consequences, really, can we compare it to kind of a Manhattan Project? Is it really that important?
I think it is over time. The Manhattan Project, as you know, was done in wartime secrecy. We looked at the question of whether we could build a Manhattan Project for AI. In other words, let's imagine we had a place like Los Alamos. We took all the software people, all the scientists, and put a fence around them and had them build an amazing thing. And we concluded that this would not work at all. Software is different from hardware. And our analysis of software leadership is that the gaps between the West and the East, the gaps between leading countries are very small. And that the diffusion of software ideas, the good ones and the bad ones, is pretty much unstoppable. But we do believe that specialized hardware is something that you can control.
Well, let me say the chances for cooperation between Europe and America on this topic, my opinion at least, have certainly increased after Biden became president. I mean, during the Trump years, as you know, the Europeans developed concepts, or at least ideas, about strategic autonomy, autarky, etc. That was largely reflecting the belief or the fear that the Americans were no longer reliable. Now, with President Biden coming back to a more cooperative policy, that's a different game. But Eric, I think you're well aware that what Europe has to offer in terms of AI, certainly a lot of talents, but when it comes to formulating policies or writing a report as yours, that's a different matter. Some years ago, I think we had already, under President Juncker, when he was the EU president, we had already a task force called AI High Level Group or something. I'm informed that this task force has been largely discontinued, and the Europeans are more focusing on risk of AI, risks everywhere, obviously, and on privacy, etc. What do you think, frankly? You're a man of frank words. What do you think about the status of AI and policy in Europe?
So I'm sorry to be obnoxious and critical. And I want to state right up front that I'm speaking my own opinion. I no longer work at Google, so please don't hear this as anything involving Google's position. I think that the premature regulation of artificial intelligence in Europe is a disaster. And the reason is that when you regulate ahead of creativity, you cut off in imagination and ideas that people don't pursue. This field is 5 or 10% into where it's going to be. So here we have a document which was announced with great fanfare a month ago. And again, I'm sorry to be so critical. And what it basically says is that AI needs to be regulated, that Europe is very proud of how the GDPR forced the globe into its privacy rules, which I'm not sure is actually true, but that's what Europeans say to each other. And now the Europeans, instead of inventing the future, are going to regulate the work of others. That's a defensive position. It's a weak position. I can assure you that the Chinese are not going to listen to Brussels' EU regulation around AI. And America will try to work with Brussels to make it work. And I want to highlight one specific point which would make sense to a non-technical person and to a regulator, but is fundamentally an error. So one of the things about AI technology today is that the technology is an approximation to knowledge. It's not accurate enough to be able to tell you exactly what it knows and what it doesn't know. The most exciting aspects in AI are called universal models, where we suck enormous amounts of information together, some of which is true, some of which is false, and then we figure out what it knows. People believe that this will be the foundation of general intelligence. The specific language in the proposal says that infrastructure, which is what AI is today, will be banned in Europe unless it can fully explain everything it does. So this is a misunderstanding of what the technology can do. It just can't do it. So that's going to have to be changed. So here we are, and we're already in a fight with the regulators where Europe is not inventing its own future, right? I would much prefer to have had Europe, through your leadership and those of others, to have done your analysis of AI, your investment in AI, your investment in technology and training, and your view of the values. I think you'll find that if you read our document about values, we actually agree, right? We don't disagree over the importance of valued-centered AI. In fact, we say that the competition with China is a values-based competition. And Germany is ultimately not going to agree to Chinese values. They're going to agree to jointly German and American values. But that's not what Europeans are doing. So I view this as a real crisis of leadership. And I think that if one thing we could do today is establish that Europe needs to have a much deeper analysis of what role Europe wants to play in AI. What I want as your friend is I want strong companies doing AI development in Europe, competing with the American firms, competing with the Chinese firms. I can tell you, and I'll just finish by saying, I managed thousands and thousands of European software people. I was part of the acquisition of DeepMind, which is a UK company, which is brilliant in this area. As you said, Europeans have the talent, the people to pull this off. It's not a people problem, it's a focus problem.
Important point here, and I'm really looking forward to see how the panel under Melissa's moderation skills will discuss it in a little while. Eric, you seem to be very concerned about China. Well, nowadays everybody's concerned about China, but AI related. I remember you wrote an article last summer or so. Is China winning the AI race? Can't remember where it was. Can you be a little bit more specific about where the Chinese are? You indicate already they are not light years behind the United States. They are
right.
close.
So one of the things I've noticed in the West, that people have a stereotype of China that might have been true in the past, but is not true today. The Chinese are very well managed. They're very smart. They're moving very quickly. They have announced publicly their goal to equal or dominate in the following areas: artificial intelligence, software, semiconductors, synthetic biology, quantum computing, surveillance, electronic commerce, and energy, and high-speed transport. By the way, that's my whole world. Yeah. That's everything I'm interested in, right? It's everything that people who work in technology care about, because those are the platforms. So what I would like to say, and we speak about this in the report, is that we have serious platform competition between the West and China. And if you are confused as to what happens when you lose a platform, look at what's happened with 5G and Huawei. many countries are finding themselves, because of inexpensive financing and cost of goods, purchasing Huawei equipment from China, when the European vendors, who are quite talented, don't have those subsidies and don't have the global platforms yet. That's a problem. And America is running around, the previous administration was running around saying to the Europeans, don't buy from Huawei. And the Europeans are saying, well, who would you like us to buy from? Right? So when you lose one of these important platforms and you don't have a good alternative, and in hindsight, what America should have done is we should have built a strong competitor in the West with Huawei, and we should have figured a way to finance it and be in the competition. So I'm very concerned that we're going to lose some of these other spaces. And once you, in my industry, when you lose these competitions, it's very hard to come back. And I'll give you an example with Huawei. Now, they're a well-run company. They're huge scale. Their customers are happy. So you and I decide, working with the established companies in Europe, to build a competitive product. Well, by the time we have a completely competitive product, Huawei will have moved forward. It's the same problem in semiconductors. We want to have 5 nanometer technology in Europe or in Arizona in our case, but by the time we get it built, Huawei's already announced that they're moving to 3 nanometer technology. So TSMC is moving to 3 nanometer technology, and they're going to spend $100 billion to make that happen. So the stakes are enormous here. And I think what people don't understand is that so much of our economic growth is now contingent upon synthetic biology. Think about the impact of synthetic biology on European pharma, right? AI in terms of drug discovery. Think about all of the networks and systems that are used within Europe, all the banking systems and so forth will be affected by this, let alone the issues around semiconductors and quantum and so forth.
Eric, just on that, I mean, you mentioned we should stay 2 generations ahead of the Chinese, or the US should stay 2 generations ahead. When you translate that into years, what does that mean in terms of how many years is that?
The cycles in semiconductors are roughly every 2 years. And so that's roughly a 4-year timeline. We think that that's achievable, but only with some significant changes. One of the things in the West is the West largely got out of making semiconductors because it was very expensive. It's very difficult. It requires an enormous amount of capital. And we were happy to have it done in Singapore and in Southeast Asia. That is a national security issue. I would want Europe to have its own foundries, its own fabs. I would want America to have its own foundries and fabs, just from a national security supply chain basis. Now, they don't have to be enormous and they don't have to be hugely expensive, but they have to be at the state of the art. And that problem is a really hard problem. So it's not going to happen. So we're very clear, without some form of federal money, state money, either as loans or guaranteed markets or other ways, the capital cost is so high to build these things that's why we got out of it way back when. And that was, by the way, an error. In hindsight, I've been working on this for 20 years. 20 years ago, those decisions were made, and everybody said, oh, it's okay, it's too expensive, we can't really do it. That was a mistake in the United States, as was the lack of leadership in 5G. Those are mistakes that we're suffering from now.
Eric, let's come back to the transatlantic relationships, i.e. what we can do together here. Mentioned already that President Biden is visiting Europe next week, I think. And he will talk about China. He will talk about trade issues, the obvious question of what can we do together better. Will he specifically refer also to the AI technology initiative and to the report? As a matter of fact, I think it would be a very good thing if he offered the Europeans to have a substantive briefing. I mean, at government level of the final report that you've just published. You testified in Senate. Why not to the EU leaders?
Well, okay. So first place, I'm always available to visit and talk to European leaders, just as I'm willing to talk to US leaders. and all of us care so much about this. We're happy to visit and do whatever it takes. The EU has proposed something called an EU-US Trade and Technology Council. And it would be really nice if our proposal, which is called a Emerging Technology Council, was merged in some way with that idea. Mm-hmm. I think the ideas are similar because the people who are studying this in Europe do understand this platform competition that I'm describing. So I think the ideal scenario would be out of Biden's visit in a week that there was an agreement to have the State Department and its emerging technology groups speak to the appropriate Brussels and national government groups. And obviously we'll support that in any way we can. We have, with some conversation, I think we're going to agree together on the majority of what I've just said. The urgency, the importance of leading. I can give you plenty of examples. What happens if the internet becomes a source of misinformation because the Russian technology dominates and the Russians put all of their misinformation engines into the internet along the way? That would drive our politicians crazy. And it would be strategic for the Russians to actually do that. What happens if the technology that China is building around surveillance is used across the internet in such a way that the things that you're doing are being tracked in Chinese companies and available to the Chinese government? That's clearly not okay. So what would happen if the chips that we all used had Russian or Chinese or Iranian or whatever, whoever you pick as a bad guy, influence inside the chips so that we cannot provably say that our systems are secure from that kind of interference? It makes sense to me that we need this control over our own environment. And we're a big enough market together. Europe is 800 million people. The United States is 300 million people. I forget how big India is, but you can imagine. Think about how big Japan is, how big South Korea is. We're talking about more than 1 billion people who collectively can build these platforms around democratic values. And that's a scale that can compete with the very well-run, very large Chinese investment in these technology areas in STEM computing and education and so forth.
Certainly.
But the only way, remember, they don't have to have all these meetings internally. Yeah. They don't have 27 countries to have to vote on this stuff. They can just decide. We need a mechanism where we can collectively decide fairly quickly to pursue certain areas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've had a very successful multilateral platform between the two sides of the Atlantic with NATO. I mean, certainly the military aspects can be dealt with by NATO, but a NATO-like organization might be an idea. Eric, we're running out of time here. Certainly a very, very ambitious project and lots of aspects to talk about. But let me come up with my final question. You plan a summit, an artificial intelligence summit, I think in Washington in July. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is European participation welcome, or is it US only?
Well, it's what I hope will happen is it will be majority US and European. This event is on July 13th. It's in Washington, D.C. It's in person for people who are vaccinated, obviously. We understand that people cannot travel because of all sorts of COVID issues. So there'll be an appropriate way to do it virtually as well. But we're trying to the degree that we can do it to move this agenda forward and get these communications going. The commission that I'm responsible for ends in October, and it's not going to be extended. So this is our window to get these ideas into, frankly, the people who are watching this video and interview between you and me. We need you to read our report, decide what you like, criticize, and participate, because that will build the shared agreement of how we go forward. A situation where Europe doesn't choose is a situation where Europe loses. Because the distinctions between these two strategies are sufficiently different, and Gilman can talk about this at some length, that it's important that we understand that you're going to be forced to choose, at least in certain areas. And I'm not arguing to not work with China. I'm not arguing to decouple with China. I'm saying in these areas, we have a strategic competition. And the strategic competition is around platforms and values and investment. And the winners of that will determine the outcome of trillions of dollars of economy. In our report, we estimated that the winners in various of these, like AI, are 10 and 20 trillion dollar businesses because of the scale. And you can read our analysis and see if you agree with it, but it's big.
Well, thank you very, very much, Eric, for your forceful presentation. It's a very ambitious project. One thing I can promise you, I think your findings, your recommendations will certainly stimulate the debate in Europe, which is something that we badly need. And we as a little think tank will do our best to contribute to that kind of debate. So thank you very much for your time, Eric. Please.
And thank you for making this an important priority. I hope that we work with you for a very long time on this. This problem is not going to go away, and it's going to get worse. Yeah. So let's get on it now.
Absolutely. Thank you for today. And I think we are now interested to hear what our distinguished panel makes out of that. I think some of the stuff, Eric was very blunt, very succinct, as I said, very forceful. So hard to misread him. I'm very interested to hear some dissenting voices as well on this debate, as well as consenting. So over to you, Melissa, as a moderator of this panel discussion. Once again, thank you very much, Eric.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eric. I'm Melissa Heikkilä. I'm Politico's AI correspondent in London. Joining me today in this panel are Mario Brandenburg, who's a member of the German Bundestag and chairman of the Digital Agenda Committee, as well as Ilman Louis, Commissioner for the National Security Commission on AI, Jörg Wienert, who's the chairman of Germany's Federal AI Association, Simona Soare, who's a senior associate and analyst at the European Institute for Security Studies, as well as Tyson Barker, who's a head of technology and global affairs at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I'm already seeing lots of questions from the audience, which is excellent. Keep them coming in. We will dive in at the end of the panel. Now, I'd like to pick up on something Eric just said. The European Commission unveiled the world's first AI Act, which regulates some high-risk uses and bans some uses like government-conducted social scoring. Now, Eric called this a disaster, which I'm sure any viewers in Brussels would love. Now, Mario, I'd like to hear your take on this. What do you think? Do you think the AI Act and the European approach is a disaster?
So coming from the German approach, as I've heard, so the European one is pretty flexible, I would say. No, but to be honest, so as Eric correctly mentioned, unfortunately, we over here in the political scope are relatively scared about everything. I mean, there's the German Angst, and therefore the discussion actually really started from the wrong way. So what do we want to avoid instead of what do we want to achieve? And this is what you really breathe in when you read the report. On the other hand side, if you really want people to align behind it and invest, so, and this is, I mean, we are all elected by people, so there are voters who really want to know that this is in the document. So I guess for really things which are critical to Europeans, and we both know that, for example, military is super different and super complicated here in the EU, that's, I guess it's logical that we take another step. I have to agree to some extent to Eric, because I was fighting these risk levels. In Germany, we want to have 5 of it. So the problem coming out of software industry is who's going to decide that, and who can decide it fast enough in the end to categorize. So others build products until we go on categorizing this could be riskful. And only because something is health, it's not necessarily riskful. So to be honest, I criticize that. I think we need to draw a red line, which actually is in the US report as well. So that was important, but we lose time and basically we lose traction. And this is what it is about in that race. So it's not a philosophical race. It's about basically who brings down the products and the facts more early. And I admit that Europe has to be faster there, and not everybody is already understanding the power with, for example, China has to come up on that topic.
Thank you. Now, Jörg, do you think the AI Act slows down innovation as much as Eric warned or thinks.
Yes, it definitely slows down innovation, and but even more, the GDPR and the copyright laws that are already in place slow down innovation in regards to AI in Germany and Europe already since years. So we have a huge competitive disadvantage here, also in regards to the US and. What we've seen in the AI regulation so far is not as bad as we were fearing it to be, because it's focusing on applications, on risk-based approaches. There are several things that have to be aligned in detail, and we are participating in this discussion because, on the other hand, we are aware of that there will be an AI regulation. I don't think that the European Commission will forget about this project. So we are trying to make it as feasible as possible for our AI industry in Germany and in Europe. We are also working together with 8 other associations in Europe. So the current approach is somehow a good start. It could be worse, but I think what we fear right now is that the parliament and the governments make it even worse in the upcoming discussion that lasts 1.5 or 2 years. And what's very difficult for us, and especially for our investors, is the uncertainty, because we are facing a lot of investors that are not willing to invest in European startups and business models because they are not they're not knowing what to come. If potentially the AI regulation forbids about the business models they invested in.
Now, Tyson, what do you think? We've heard one US opinion. How do you think the AI Act will be received elsewhere in the world? Do you think it could have potential to become a global standard as the EU wants it to be?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, if we look at the legislation, it has clearly garnered a lot of attention. We even had a tweet from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, congratulating Europe on introducing and opening up this debate. We do see legislation already taking place to put in guardrails around the usage of artificial intelligence at the local level. Several cities in the United States, for example, and even in some specific domains. So there are regulations in place around certain usage in the financial sector, for example, applying pre-existing laws in that area in many countries, including the United States. Everybody's watching because everybody has the experience of GDPR. And as Eric Schmidt correctly noted, GDPR is seen as a success, a geopolitical success in many ways in Europe, because it has been exported to other countries, to other states, California, for example, and companies have adopted it as a kind of baseline for privacy. But we don't want to get complacent. There was a study that just came out about innovation, the state of innovation in 90 countries. And the authors talked about innovation in Europe and said that it is slowing down. And the way they categorized European innovation right now is they said Europe is has digital arthritis. And we don't want to do anything that kind of calcifies the ability to innovate within Europe. So these conversations and making sure that they are interoperable and global, including with partners like the United States, is really important. And the other big important thing that Europe really needs to focus on is the question of market access. So with democratic partners like the United States and Japan. So what kind of technology can Europe export to authoritarian states, dual use technologies? What does it consider trustworthy vendors beyond 5G? What does the state of strategic industry look like for investment, particularly for companies that are, for example, members of the AI Association that Jörg Bienert is a member of? And what is the status of research? Who is investing in research non-commercial research, and how is it being commercialized? Those are kind of good constructive questions that I think that the US and Europe should be talking about. But they're going to have to talk about this AI regulation because it's going to be with us along with the rest of the legislative package.
Thanks, Tyson. Gilman, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on the European approach versus the US approach to AI. What are the main differences? And we mentioned values, but could you maybe be more concrete in what similarities we have?
Yeah, well, it's I had a chance to read the proposed legislation last night, and it was very interesting reading. Right, I mean, clearly the Europeans went through a lot of debate. They drew on their experts, and I don't want to minimize the level of effort that went into this. Right, and their selection of what I guess they call option 3+. Given the framework, the choices they had made a lot of sense, right? This idea of proportionality, focusing on critical systems, not on, just a blanket approach. Nevertheless, I think the general concerns on fostering innovation is if you start, as Eric was saying, using a regulatory mindset as the first step of your framing, that's a very defensive position. I think many of us on the technology side and folks on the commission view, what we need to do actually is increase innovation. For example, how can we co-invest in technologies that will do a better job in testing, validating, and verifying the algorithms that we will apply AI against in specific domains of use? How can we think about the use of new approaches to AI, not just machine learning? What's interesting is this happens all the time between people who are in the field of studying artificial intelligence and techniques of artificial intelligence and people who try to do policy. For people who do policy, AI and ML are the same thing. For us engineers, one is a complete subset of the other. Many of the issues around data, around training, about bias is based on where the state of the technology is today. And the danger on the regulatory front versus a policy front or a standards front, which are other tools that you could use in your tool belt, is that it's hard to undo, right? And once you put those frameworks, regulatory frameworks in place, you create infrastructure around the enforcement of those regulatories, yet technology moves along at a rate much faster than you can write. So I think our view is this. Look, there is a role for regulatory use. That should be focused on very specific use cases. And somebody asked me, so how do we know? I mean, how do we know what's a good regulation or a bad regulation? So I have a simple set of tools I use. I replace the word AI in any proposed legislation with the words either algorithm or person. If it doesn't make sense to put the person in the same set of regulation or algorithms, then it probably doesn't make sense to regulate AI. On the other hand, if you would say, I wouldn't let a person do this, I probably won't let an AI do this. Now, it isn't always true, but I think it's really important. AI is a component in a system. It is not a system unto itself. And so when we think about regulation, we think about standards, we think about explainability and transparency, we have to put that into context. So I think, and this is another point I think I want to emphasize that Eric made, we're so early in the ballgame. It is, think about it this way. This is about 1915 in the era of airplanes, right? And we're trying to regulate commercial flight based on the state of the art of 1915, right? So we have to be careful. We have to be thoughtful. There is a role for regulation, but it is not the only tool in the tool belt.
Great. My analysis of the European approach is that Europe is trying to come up with a third way of doing AI, whereas what you, Gilman, said is that the US feels like we need to do something now before things get out of hand. Simona, what do you think of this? Do you agree with that Europe doesn't get the Chinese threat, or do Europeans just have other priorities?
Yes, thank you for the question. I actually don't necessarily agree with the fact that Europeans don't see the Chinese threat. I think we're looking at it through fairly different lenses. And Europeans are still very much interested in the broader framework of a geo-economic world that we live in. I think that this is the lens that they're looking at the Chinese challenge through in respect to tech competition. So I think that there is increasing awareness of the challenges that arise from Chinese investment. There is certainly a lot of concern in Brussels as well as around European capitals with respect to where we place ourselves as Europeans in this technology competition. But I also think that there is still some hope that a complete split or decoupling with China is avoidable, and that this will not ultimately affect the global economy as well as the European economy in the long term. So I think that this is where Europeans are coming from. Whether you want to call this a third way, I have my own issues with the phrasing, because I think it misrepresents where Europeans stand, not just in the relationship with China and the US, but really in the relationship with ourselves as well, where Europeans are very true to their values. I think this comes through very strongly in the AI Act. And I also want to emphasize this is not a singular thing. We're not just talking about the AI regulation. We're also talking about it in the context of a broader European approach to technology, whether you want to call it digital sovereignty or whether you're associating more closely to the industrial package and what we're trying to do there. I think that there's definitely a lot of consideration in Europe on how we emphasize that area where our vulnerabilities are closed, but also our potential for innovation is explored and enhanced. And I think that, and I'd like to close with this, is there is an ample space in the digital compact, which is different from the AI regulation, but is somewhat connected as well, for partnerships. I think that the other thing that comes through from this European approach to AI is partnerships, is multilateralism. I think Europeans see them as so very closely connected, which is why we're seeing quite a lot of ambitious thinking in Brussels around tech diplomacy and how we can enhance our cooperation with the United States, not just in a purely transatlantic environment, but also broaden that out a little bit with international partners.
Great. Now that brings us nicely to my next question. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden is coming to Europe next week, and he'll be in Brussels next Tuesday, actually. And European Commission's Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager recently said that is when they hope to launch an EU-US Trade and Tech Council. Now, we don't have many details, but the idea is to have a platform for more US collaboration. Now, I want to hear from all of you. What do you think this council should do and achieve? Simona, why don't you start, please?
Yes, thank you. I think that the Trade and Tech Council is a great idea. I also fall on Eric's line of perhaps the merging that with the emerging tech council that the Commission is proposing is definitely not a bad idea. Personally, I would like to see more engagement and much more of a proactive attitude from the new administration. I think that expectations in Brussels were certainly that the US would engage faster with some of these proposals, and the TTC is only one of these. I think that the high-level dialogue on China is also lagging a little bit behind, and also issues related to a dedicated security and defense dialogue between the US and the EU are also sort of not moving quite as fast as Brussels was expecting, as well as European partners were expecting. So I think that there's great potential there. I'm a little concerned with merging trade and tech, because in theory, if this works, it's great. If for some reason it doesn't and it gets stuck, then we're stuck on both fronts. And I do understand that we're trying to emphasize the digital economy side of it. We're trying to emphasize the technology side of our relationship as well and bolster that up. But also, I think due consideration for where the roadblocks could fall and how this could impact the working of the council moving forward, not just in the next 4 years, but potentially after that is an important thing to keep in mind.
Great. Now, Tyson, I saw you nodding when Simona said merging trade and tech could be problematic. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I am a veteran of the Obama administration and worked on TTIP, and have some experience with the Transatlantic Economic Council, and have followed the new transatlantic agenda, which tried to create a transatlantic marketplace between the US and EU. So I've walked past the graveyard of great cooperation initiatives, and know that some of these very difficult issues, be it chlorinated chicken or the way that you solve disputes among investors, might bog down and distract from what is very urgent questions around emerging technology, where the US and Europe still have a lot of power, and there's a lot of action going on specifically in Brussels around regulation. On the Trade and Tech Council, it's great tee up, because I have a longer piece coming out tomorrow or on Thursday, which actually puts together some concrete recommendations in 5 areas. The first is an industrial policy. I think that the two sides need to push for strategic interdependence. And a great place to start is on semiconductors. I think somebody mentioned in the chat box that, Intel has been speaking to Thierry Breton, has been considering establishing a fab in Germany, in the Lausitz. There is a great ecosystem in Germany and in Europe in equipment, in design, in packaging, research. Why not build a consortium, a transatlantic consortium that can build that independent capacity in Europe? So thinking about strategic interdependence on the industrial policy front. The second is this issue of market access. We talk a lot about strategic autonomy here in Europe, but what about democratic autonomy? Making sure that we have deepened our relationships and also hardened our external border to make sure that we have control over our space and the kind of technologies that are being used. Some of the issues that I mentioned earlier would fall into this under market access. Then you have the global rule book. Europe has not just the AI regulation, but other major regulations, the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, new cloud rules coming up, the Data Governance Act, a Data Act coming up. These are all going to have an impact on the way AI is developed in Europe. So that's something that they should really intensify the discussion on, which I think Brussels would like. And the last 2 areas are really latching up on ICT development standards for the Global South to really kind of lift that up to the next level. I know the G7 is thinking about talking about that. The Connectivity Fund in Europe is engaging with that more as a potential counter to the Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road. And finally, of course, digital rights. I mean, we really do need, if we want to have this democratic mantra, we really need to make sure that it is human-centric and make sure that the rights of the individuals are protected. And so if Biden is planning to do this Summit for Democracy later this year, I think that a US-EU collaboration on digital rights would be a great place to start. So those are a couple of items that I would put on the agenda for that Trade and Tech Council.
Excellent, thanks. Now, Mario, what's your sense? First of all, what do you want to see in this council, and what have you heard? What does Germany want to be on it?
So as I said in our chat before, everybody is super excited over here just to see how the discussion's going, basically. Tyson put some things on the list, which are absolutely right. I think we can only be more efficient if we establish a process or a place where we consistently talk about tech issues. So, I mean, it's people or processes, and people in politics change, but you need a process that we constantly align on what we want to achieve. And so, for example, being critical on the German AI strategy, we win in everything. We are super. I've read the British one, they win in everything. France wins in everything, you win in everything. So this makes me question if this really makes sense. So speaking from a German perspective, surely we're obsessed with cars and mobility. So this is probably something we will focus on. We want autonomous vehicles. We are good in pharma and whatever, chemistry. Quantum computing looks good. We've got a lot of physicists here, lots of patents. So these are things we really can focus on. And if we would agree that the US will then rely on us, but otherwise we might not have to build every semiconductor company from scratch. And surely we do this in Germany because there needs to be a basic level. This is what we learned from America First, or maybe an aggressive Chinese approach. You need to have a baseline to exist. But in the end, I think the more you talk and the more you regain the trust, this is the way to go, because it's not true for Europe that we can lead everything. And it's even not true for the US that you can lead in everything. And I don't see the place where you can discuss that. And therefore, I'm as well seeing it critical to put trade in that, because these are democratic political interests. And the other things are, in the end, is business and money. And it does not help. It stacks, in my opinion. First, we want to know what we want to do on a tech level together, and then we can still do the business part. So therefore, on the list, definitely semiconductors, quantum technologies, quantum security. We've got pretty strong cybersecurity institutes over here. These are niche spaces where we can be really successful, but I wouldn't say that we can dominate or that we should dominate every market. It's just not realistic as 80 million people and an elderly society.
Great. Now, Jörg, from an industry perspective, what do policymakers need to nail in this council? Like, what do you want to see happening?
I think Tyson and Mario, you gave already a very good overview. Just a few things on a more detailed level to add, maybe. On one hand, Mario, I think quantum technology is really one thing to focus on, because if China takes off here and is in front of us, then we are getting into severe problems, in terms of data security and all these issues, and especially even if we don't know what they are already having. So I think we definitely have to invest a lot and jointly into quantum technologies. Secondly, this is the Open RAN initiative. We talked about Huawei and the dominance in the 5G market. I think Open RAN is an open source initiative in order to fight this close to monopoly. And one additional thing I think that would help German companies and also US companies on both sides is getting clearance about the data security in regards to cloud services. The unclear situation in regards to privacy shield, Schrems II legislation, Schrems II jurisdiction, and the Cloud Act hinders a lot of German and European companies to move to the cloud and to be innovative in that space, and also to use and develop AI applications.
Thank you. Now, Gilman, we've heard a bit about your proposal for an emerging technology council. What have you heard from Washington? Like, are they keen in adopting something like this, or would they would they want to participate in a trade and technology council?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the commission is an advisory commission, right? So we're advising the U.S. Congress, and the executive branch is engaged, and there's strong interest on, how do we engage other nations, other democracies, particularly on these areas of emerging tech. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm for that right now. The exact structure and how we put the pieces together, right? People are still working out that details, and hopefully dialogue, whether it be direct or track 2 dialogue, will begin to emerge a strategy to go down a particular path. But I think we should kind of start from a different framework. I mean, I think a lot of people consider this is this really a West versus China, arms race? It's about Chinese containment, and while it's easy to put those kind of Cold War metaphors against this, I think we need to think more about what it should be the international community's acceptable, agreed upon ways responsible nations should act when they're applying these technologies. And it's hard to remove trade from the technologies. I mean, just think about this. We understand from the Chinese point of view that these areas of technologies are, in their minds, very critical for the reemergence of China as a world power, right? This kind of, fourth industrial revolution around, IT and bio and quantum and all the fields that Eric talked about. The need for that leadership for that country to get there. They have made a whole nation commitment to doing that. Now, we in the West, it's very easy for us to get nationalistic. Everybody wants to have their own fabs. Everybody wants to have their own, complete supply chain. But the reality is, first of all, these technologies are really expensive. I mean, a fab is, it's $20 billion of direct investment, not to mention the investment of the talent you need to actually educate your workforce, actually operate a fab, right? You want to play in the quantum computing? Well, it's pretty clear why Microsoft and Google and maybe a handful of other commercial companies and a handful of nation states have the toys to play with. But there's another factor here. In the West, our most critical asset are our people, our talent, right? And we should make available the necessary infrastructure on a multilateral basis, whether it's for research and development, for information sharing, for allowing our ethical principles to seep into the technology that we are building, to be able to access that. And that requires multilateral engagement, right? This isn't so much, how do we reduce supply chain risk? This is about increasing diversity of resources to solve kind of world-class problems, but make sure that we end up in a democratic view of the uses of these technologies and applications of these technologies versus an authoritarian use of these technologies. And that's where the real battle lines are, right? And so trade is important. If somebody steals a piece of IP, builds a product or range of products to companies, and then brings it back into the marketplace, how would the rest of the countries treat that piece of technology, right? What should their standards be? Data handling standards and privacy, right? Security and harmony are critical components of the Chinese mindset. They're not necessarily our first things that we think about here in the West, which is about democracy and individualism and human rights. So we as a group of countries need to agree on some basic principles and how we're going to operationalize that. And only by dialogue through the creation of these organizations can we have that. But the time is running on us. The Chinese have already set the timetable, right? They have publicly announced 2025, 2035, 2049 as hard lines where they're trying to aspire to get to their places in the technology stack. What we need to do on the West is to provide not only an alternative, but make sure if somebody chooses the West, not only is it a better standard, meets our kind of ethical frameworks, but also will not be vulnerable to authoritarian technologies.
And what do you think would be the right international platform to do this in practice? Would it be the UN or NATO or something else?
I think idealistic, those are great places to think about, but in actual practice, they're very slow and very bureaucratic. We won't meet the timetables. I think it's time for like-minded nations through multilateral engagement to sit around and quickly roll up the sleeves and get to work. And hopefully like-minded nations will join in on that effort. Some may not be ready to, but we can't wait. We can't debate to 2049 to come up with an agreement when a competitor out there will dominate those platforms.
Thanks. Mario, do you have anything in response to what Gilman just said about having to hurry and international platforms being too slow and bureaucratic?
I mean, it's absolutely right what he said. This is why I before said it's rather people or processes, and processes take longer. So if there are ambitious leaders who want to start, they have to talk. And as Tyson said with TTIP, we all learned that aiming for the big shot wall makes us happy until we die. might not be the best solution, and just go forward where you can do that. So therefore, I'm absolutely on his side when it comes to speed. And since in the questions, the initiative like Gaia X was mentioned, where the Europeans basically put a lot of hope into, this is basically the first time where the countries who say, yes, we want to move forward, and companies who want to say, yes, let's move forward, let's build something. So at least they started to walk. Should they be faster? Yes. What will be the outcome? I don't know. But this is the first time I really feel that something's going to happen. Like, we understood it. And unfortunately, we lost plenty of time. So we ignored the internet for, I don't know, the last 30 years. So right now we understand that this is a problem, but we are now in the middle of the AI battle. So I'm really convinced that I would say the majority of the people and 1/3 of the politicians understood how urgent it is. But then waiting for all initiatives to really buy in will not work. So the ones who want to start should start. And in the end, the companies we now find a bit too powerful, they also didn't wait for something. They were just starting, and we all made them powerful. So if we want a different solution, if we want a different mindset, if we want a different democracy, then we should start to build it in the end. And therefore, yes, go ahead.
Great. Now, the NSC, Gilman, your report had a real sense of urgency, and your comments have had a real sense of urgency. I don't really see that, especially in the defense and security context. Now, in the EU proposal, it excludes military AI completely. Simona, do you think that's a big mistake?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a crucial question, but I'll answer it this way. The Commission, in the legal envelope that is trying to use for this AI regulation, could not have included military AI. So that stands apart under the treaties. It's a completely different topic. Whether we're going to discuss about indirect effects of how the Commission is regulating AI more broadly, and how the industrial side of this trickles down through R&D and innovation efforts and private-public partnerships into the security and military topic, then that's a different topic. And I think that there will be a trickle-down effect. But so, as I said, military stands very differently, where we're discussing military aspects in different working groups in the Council, as well as under the European Defence Agency. I think that the agency itself is quite advanced in putting together not just a taxonomy for the member states to sort of speak the same language in terms of AI, which is what the Commission, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, did in the beginning, sort of in Congress as well. We're also trying to put together an AI implementation plan that's well been approved now, and member states are starting to work towards it. There is, though, I would say, one aspect that concerns me, and that is the fact that there is very little scope for cooperation at this moment. If we're looking at the time frame of 2021, which is when we're now in 2025, the European Defence Agency, through the PESCO review and through other mechanisms, found very little scope for cooperation on emerging and disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence. So what we're looking at in the military and to a certain degree in the security and home affairs area is a very fragmented market where national initiatives go their own way. One would hope that NATO would come with a layer that is going to bring some more coherence, not just among the Europeans, but also transatlantic, among the transatlantic partners, including here Canada, the US, and the UK, of course. But we'll see what the results of the summit are next week, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think everyone's very, very excited. Gilman, do you see potential for transatlantic AI cooperation in the military realm?
Yeah, but there's a lot of work that the militaries need to do, right? First of all, I think we raised a specific concern in our national security report that we need to make sure we have appropriate testing and evaluation, validation, verification capabilities on any of these systems that use AI, right? It's one thing to say, let's have autonomous systems. It's another thing to field it. And we know that some of our competitors out there have already fielded weapon systems with apparently very little testing. And that's a very scary proposition to have, nation states is throwing stuff up on the battlefield. That's not appropriate. We think it's very important that militaries comply with the IHL standards, right? And there's a whole argument that still needs to be resolved between when to use autonomous systems and when not to use autonomous systems. That's a dialogue that we need together with other democracies to have. We were pretty explicit that we're not in favor of a ban because we felt that A, it's hard to enforce, B, our competitors are not necessarily going to do so. But generally, I think many of us believe smarter systems that reduce unintended casualties are generally better than dumber systems that, can, arbitrarily do harm. So thinking through those are really, really important. I think the other areas of immediate cooperation is interoperability, right? These systems, when you use AI, depend on interoperability of sharing data, sensory information, command and control, right? Safety protocols. Those discussions need to happen now, right? And it'd be really unfortunate if all of our countries go off on our own, do something completely separate. And we find ourselves in a situation where our systems, even on the cyber front, can't communicate, can't share, can't inform each other. That just leaves us too vulnerable in too many ways for our adversaries to exploit us. So we can't wait 5 years to be able to start that discussion. We need to start it right away.
Great, thank you. I'd like to take an audience question here. Now, this is from Louis Dinar, and I guess it was for Eric, but I'd like to ask all of you. What do you see are the key AI policy areas in which we are likely to see AI cooperation? Now, we talked about military, but could there be others like health, for example, or agriculture? And which areas are prone to confrontation? Jörg, we haven't heard from you in a while. Why don't we start with you?
I think there is just one important aspect starting right now these days. What we've seen a half a year ago is the rise of the large AI models, starting with GPT-3, which made a lot of buzz in the market as being the largest AI model developed by OpenAI and now distributed by Microsoft. And I think these large AI models require a lot of resources, require a lot of data and a lot of effort, and have the potential to really disrupt the market, because there might be a situation where we are seeing one or a few large AI models, universal models for a lot of different applications, and there might be only niches for other participants. And just a few days ago, the Chinese, I think it was Beijing University, announced Wudao, which is a model 10 times larger as GPT-3, beating, and it's multimodal model, which means that it doesn't only cover language, but also images and other sources. And they are already working on similar models for manufacturing, for healthcare, for drug design, protein folding, like Google DeepMind AlphaFold. And that shows that they are putting a lot of effort into these areas. And this is, I think, this is in terms of AI industry, the largest current threat, even from China, that we are losing ground here. And that's also a reason why we in Germany and Europe started an initiative which is called Large European AI Models, in order to be able to get the resources, to get the money to build these moonshot projects, establish the infrastructure to be able to implement these large AI models as well. And especially in respect to what just we got to know from China, I think we need a collaboration between the US and Europe in this area as well.
How important is it that these language models are done in European languages? Right now, the sophisticated models are in English and in Chinese.
I think it's important that we support all different European languages, because then the several markets will not be able to use it. And given the fact that these models really can be huge, I think it shouldn't make any problem to implement this, given the basis and the fact that we might have the enough resources in the future. So and it's also an important question, and coming back to the European and the Western values, to assure that in terms of language and in terms of bias and potential discrimination, which is due to the training data implemented into this models has to be covered, and it has to be worked on these issues. So this is a continuous process on improving these models, and we definitely have to stay ahead here.
Great. Tyson, what do you think? What would you like to see more AI policy collaboration in?
Well, at least in the transatlantic space, I think that the first thing that needs to happen is not an direct AI issue, but it's a data issue, and that's getting some kind of durable solution to Privacy Shield. So after the European Court of Justice struck down the US-EU agreement, which was essentially creating a Schengen space for the transfer of personal data across the Atlantic, it created a great deal of uncertainty in the digital space that both Europeans and Americans rely on so heavily. And I think it's not worth understating that a lot of the technologies that have been so essential for the resilience in the economy in Europe and the United States were only possible because you could transfer data across the Atlantic. So making sure that we have a clear, predictable, reliant way of free flow of data is very, very important. And that's going to happen in the next couple of months. As far as an area of AI collaboration, we talked about semiconductors. Germany, Europe, this is an IoT heartland. The innovation industrial base is going to be on IoT, machinery, auto, appliances, et cetera. And so I think that there's a lot of potential for work on industrial data and also on just use of artificial intelligence in the Internet of Things, both industrial Internet of Things, smart cities, and consumer Internet of Things. So I think that that's a good place to start. And I think that there's a good news story to tell there, or could be.
Great. Now, another question from the audience. How would you evaluate initiatives like Gaia X when talking about how to make German and European firms moving into cloud technology? I think I would like to add there, Gaia X, for those of you who don't know, is a Franco-German cloud platform and standard-setting organization that is intended to be pan-European. And often it's seen as like a symbol of European digital sovereignty. Mario, what do you think? I mean, you have these initiatives like Gaia X, which are clearly very, very European. At the same time, we're talking about international collaboration. Do you see those working together?
I would say it's an European initiative already. So many other countries joined. It's true. I mean, in Germany and France started it. But to be honest, I'm in favor of Gaia X, because I think that it's really the first time companies and politicians, more or less, or countries sit together and really think about interoperability. We heard that in so-called Sunday speeches and stuff, but what does that really mean and what comes with it? Everybody says, yes, that's super. But it really means I can take my data to the competitor. Do I really want this? If I'm the Deutsche Telekom, do I want OVH to do that? And before, we came from basically the historical understanding to build our little towers, but we didn't really look to the other side of the ocean, finding out that others have built multiple towers, which are far more bigger. And therefore, there is, first of all, a value in itself that they are forced to think about how to build that European ecosystem. And it's not only a European project. It's very controversial that, for example, Google and Amazon, they are basically joined Gaia X, and they're allowed to work with the Gaia X team at some certain areas, because it makes no sense to build something which nobody will use. Again, I made that point with Facebook or Amazon. But the tech stack from Amazon, it's super. So they were not getting powerful because they were offering us a lousy product. It was so good that people went there. And if you build a product without talking to them, you probably build it basically without having a market. But coming from a decentralized tradition in Europe, multiple countries being forced to work together, I think it's only logical that we focus on how to build a network of interoperability. Because personally, and now the data guy in myself, the computer scientist comes out, I think that loosely coupled but good connected networks will always beat one monolithic structure. And therefore, this is actually the way how to beat down huge companies, huge data buckets. Nobody wants them anymore. Political, so the policy is getting active. Even the people questioning is that good. This is why you see so much going on in all the blockchain and decentralized sphere. And I think if Europe takes the lead there, because it's just natural for us, it's in our nature to work together, to cooperate, to interact. This is actually a strength. And if Gaia X can manage all of that, I don't know. But was it okay to start? Hell yes, it was time to do that.
Great, thank you. Another audience question. This is for you, Gilman. Now, the master frame of your report regarding China is an openly adversarial one. This may trigger a self-fulfilling prophecy spiral and make a cold or even hot war with China inevitable. Is that a risk to be reflected in the context of the report?
Well, it is clear there is a theme of high concern in our report, again, against the context of China already making proclamations of AI supremacy and the use of AI currently by the Chinese in things like surveillance technology and population suppression, right? So of course, that's going to raise a concern. Add that to malign information, that just kind of raises everybody's antennas. I will also say there were voices on the commission, and it's also reflective in our report. There are bases of both cooperation and friendly competition. Again, our goal is not to, in some ways contain China's competitiveness in terms of adding capabilities that further humanitarian uses of AI, but rather the misuses of AI or where they use coercion or other approaches, IP theft, in order to kind of leap over, right, existing players in the marketplace. I think the Europeans and Americans in the other Asian countries are happy to compete with China as long as the play field is level. But it is very difficult to have a level play field if you have a country like China with its mass and capabilities and knowledge and talent. And you got to look at the Chinese and what they've done in the last 30 to 40 years and look at them with awe and respect. But the flip side is when they choose a national champion and use whole of government to further that company's goals, and you have military civil fusion, that's different than dual use or civil military fusion, where it's military first, right? Those are different rules of the road. So even on things like dual use, you might say, great, this is a great piece of technology. Let's license it to the Chinese. It'll make the next great smartphone. But if it's in the next weapon guidance system that's bearing down on your troops, you should be thinking twice about those issues. So, look, as Eric says, sometimes you can't have it both ways. And I think it's dangerous to think that you can just sit on the side and make it all go away. Good competition. Let's compete on things like space exploration, because that, it's always fun to have that level of competition. And that if that gets us to Mars faster, great. But if a missile gets launched and the defense system needs to pick it up, you don't want your system to come in second best because it puts your nation state at risk. I also believe that there is a dialogue between the West and the Chinese and the Russians, just like we had with the Russians on nuclear weapons and proliferation. I think there's some red lines. We outlined one of them. We clearly don't believe first launch should be given in control of an AI, for example, right? Where we should sit down and have the unpleasant but necessary conversations of where things can go off the rails if we have unchecked competition or we create a second arms race. It's neither to China's interests, the European interests, or our interests to kind of get ourselves back into that Cold War mentality. We will always have areas that we disagree with, but there's clear lines that no civil society, nobody who is a responsible nation should ever cross. We need to have that dialogue, and we kind of need to have it sooner than later.
Great, thank you. We have a few more minutes left, but I want to hear Simona's reaction to that and your thoughts on the original question about, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, I think that the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy means that it's in our power to dictate or shape in a very large degree what China does and how it reacts and how it sets its goals. And these are very national, very internal processes that the West, not just the United States and Europe, but the West altogether, I think we need to acknowledge that perhaps we're not going to be able to influence to a satisfactory degree in the future. So with this comes the realization, in my view, that Europeans in particular need to, the agreement that Europeans need to reach with respect to the fact that some level of competition, perhaps on the higher scale or the higher intensity scale of competition with China, is in the future unavoidable. I think that as much as we want to sort of revitalize and consolidate the transatlantic partnership, this realization that competition with China is going to be fiercer in the future is sort of a package deal with trying to consolidate the transatlantic partnership. But in terms of what this means moving forward, I wanted to raise one issue which I think we've danced around all evening, which was that of democracy. And we've talked a lot about our values and trying to embed our values into technology. And this is great at a global scale, right? So it's good. It's part of tech diplomacy. That's great. But when it comes to how we engage with technology ourselves, and this is something that I think both Europeans and the US are trying to do now, is reflect upon our relationship with democracy through the lens of technology. And I think that embedding democratic values into technology is incredibly important. But first, we also have to address the health of our own democracies. And this has been something that's been rolling downhill over the past 10 years in Europe and in the United States. So, technology is good, to put it first, but I think that the overall problem is you need to revitalize the democratic front and make technology a tool in how you do that. And that goes to the core of our relationship with China, which is fundamentally the incompatibility of our two systems and the incompatibility of the values that we put forward and that we trust most. This is something that I think should catch a lot more the attention of our policymakers moving forward. And just to end on this, I think that there's also incredible opportunity now, not just in the context of the Biden administration and the visits here in Europe, but also in the context of ongoing processes in the US. Right. The commission itself was one such process, but also in the context of what's going on in Europe. And you're talking about the idea of the conference for the future of Europe, and we're reflecting on the future of European democracy and the future of the European Union itself. So I think these are great opportunities to ask ourselves those questions and sort of see the democracy as one to put in front of other considerations in a geopolitical confrontation as well.
Excellent, thank you. We could have another panel on this topic alone. I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for all of you. This is a really, really fascinating conversation. Thank you, Tyson, Simona, Yor, Gilman, and Mario. And this conversation will be available online. So if you want to follow back, please go on the German Council's website. Thank you so much and have a great evening.